Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was the weekend before summer, and a group of 4 friends, Jake, Sarah, Emily, and Liam, decided to take a break from their hectic lives and venture into the deep woods for a weekend camping trip. They picked a remote, isolated spot on the map, miles away from the nearest road or settlement. It was a beautiful area, dense trees, a winding creek, and not a soul for miles. They thought it would be the perfect place to disconnect from everything and escape the noise of the world. The first day went as planned. They hiked through the woods, set up their camp, and settled in for a cozy evening by the fire. The air was cool, the stars shone brilliantly, and the sounds of the forest were oddly peaceful. As they sat around the fire, they told stories and laughed, blissfully unaware of the strange energy surrounding them. That night they went to bed, each settling into their tents, lulled by the sounds of nature. But as the hours passed, something felt off. Jake was the first to hear it. A faint rustling in the woods, too rhythmic to be an animal, too deliberate. He dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the wind, but the noise continued. It wasn't just in the trees. It sounded like it was getting closer. He lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling of his tent, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. But then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, and deliberate. The crunch of twigs underfoot was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking through the woods, and it was near their camp. Jake's heart began to race. He tried to wake the others, but the sound was so close now, it felt like whoever was out there was watching them. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He strained to hear, but all that met his ears was the soft rustling of leaves and the faint cracking of branches. He could feel it, the unmistakable sensation that something was out there, just beyond the firelight. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Everything went deathly silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and suffocates you. It felt like the world had stopped turning. Jake felt his heart thud painfully in his chest. He was sure he wasn't imagining it anymore. After what felt like an eternity, the silence was broken by a blood-curdling scream. Sarah. The others shot out of their tents, but before they could even reach her, another scream pierced the air, a scream full of pure terror. They sprinted toward Sarah's tent, only to find it empty, her sleeping bag in disarray, and a trail of disturbed earth leading into the woods. The panic set in. Emily, with trembling hands, grabbed the flashlight, and they scanned the forest, their hearts hammering in their chests. The light flickered across the trees, but all they saw were shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. They shouted Sarah's name, but there was no response. It was as if she had simply vanished into the woods. They searched for hours, calling her name, but the forest swallowed every sound. The further they went, the darker it became, the air growing colder. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes, blocking their way as if the forest itself was trying to keep them away from the truth. After hours of searching, Liam collapsed to his knees in despair. "She's gone," he whispered, his voice hoarse with grief. The remaining 3 returned to camp, unsure of what to do next. But when they reached the campsite, they froze. A figure stood just beyond the firelight, half shrouded in shadow. It was a person, or at least something that resembled one. The shape was tall and unnaturally thin, almost skeletal, with long, gangly arms hanging at its sides. Its face was obscured by a dark, tattered hood, but they could see its eyes, pale, almost glowing with an unnatural light, and its gaze was fixed directly on them, unblinking and full of malice. They backed away slowly, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the terror rising in their throats. Without a word, the figure turned and disappeared into the forest, as if it had never been there. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. With no sign of Sarah, they packed up in a frantic hurry and fled the campsite, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to shift around them, as though the trees themselves were closing in. They didn't stop running until they reached the nearest town, hours later. When they told the authorities what had happened, the search for Sarah turned up nothing. No sign of her, no trace. The police thought they were all just scared, young people who had wandered too far into the woods. But Jake, Emily, and Liam knew better. They knew something was out there, something old, something waiting. and they would never forget the eyes they saw in the darkness of the forest. Years passed, but the nightmares never left. The memory of Sarah's screams, the shadow that watched them, and the haunting silence that followed them out of the woods remained etched in their minds. They never spoke about it again. And though they tried to forget, deep in the forests where the trees whispered secrets, something still waited, always watching.
Story number 2.
It was a small town nestled between two mountains where everyone knew everyone else's business. The town had its charm, a peaceful place where time seemed to move slower than in the outside world. But there was an old house on the outskirts, hidden by a thicket of trees and overgrown vines. No one ever went near it. Everyone in the town knew that the house was cursed. Legend had it that many years ago, a family had lived there, a quiet, reclusive family. They kept to themselves, never interacting much with the rest of the town. But one night, without warning, the family disappeared. No one knew exactly what happened, but the house was left behind, untouched, as if the family had just vanished into thin air. The town's residents never dared to speak of it, but everyone whispered behind closed doors. One evening, a group of teenagers, full of bravado and recklessness, decided to prove that the house wasn't cursed at all. They thought it would be the perfect dare. Spend a night in the house and come back with proof that nothing was wrong. They'd had enough of the old legends and were determined to laugh in the face of fear. They arrived at the house just as the sun began to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the decaying structure. The windows were boarded up, the door sagging on its hinges, and the entire place smelled of rot. But the teenagers were unfazed. They pushed through the overgrown bushes, making their way to the front door. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under their weight. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the once bright patterns now faded and torn. There was a stale, suffocating air about the place, like it hadn't been touched in decades. As they explored the house, their footsteps echoed unnervingly in the silence. Upstairs, they found an old bedroom, its bed covered in sheets that hadn't been disturbed in years. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a dusty grandfather clock in the corner. The group gathered in the center of the room, their laughter echoing off the walls as they started to make jokes about the ghost stories the townspeople had told. But then, without warning, the clock stopped ticking. The sudden silence was like a slap in the face. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to darken, the shadows lengthening in an unnatural way. The teenagers froze, unsure of what was happening. It was then that they heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, like the softest breath against their ears. Leave. At first, they thought it was one of them playing a prank, but when they looked around, they saw that no one was near enough to have said it. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakable. Leave now. Panic set in. They rushed for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle jiggled, but the door was stuck as if something was holding it shut from the other side. They banged on the door, screaming for help, but no one was around to hear. The air grew heavier with each passing second, the temperature plummeting. Suddenly, a cold, skeletal hand reached out from under the bed, grabbing the leg of one of the girls, pulling her towards the floor. She screamed, struggling to free herself, but the hand held on tight. Her friends tried to pull her away, but it was like the house itself was fighting back. In a desperate attempt to escape, they finally managed to open the door. They bolted out into the hall, but the house seemed to warp around them. The walls were closing in, the floorboards buckling, and the stairs leading down twisted in impossible angles. They sprinted down the hallway, but no matter which way they turned, they couldn't find the front door. The house had shifted, and they were trapped. Then they heard the whisper again, this time right behind them. You shouldn't have come. A figure appeared at the end of the hall, a shadow that moved with unnatural fluidity. It was tall, towering over them, with hollow eyes and a twisted, distorted face. Its skin was ashen and cracked like old stone. The thing smiled, revealing jagged teeth, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. The group stumbled backward, terror flooding their veins. But no matter how fast they ran, the figure seemed to be everywhere, moving faster than they could comprehend. They could hear the whispers getting louder, now a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. Leave, leave, leave. The last thing they saw before everything went dark was the house, the walls now bleeding, the windows shattered, the front door wide open. But when the authorities arrived the next morning, they found nothing. No sign of the teenagers, no blood, no evidence. The house stood as it always had, silent and empty. To this day, the house still stands at the edge of town, a monument to fear and death. And the townspeople still whisper of the teenagers who went in, only to vanish without a trace, as if the house had swallowed them whole. No one dares to enter anymore, and anyone who even looks too long at the house is said to hear the whispers leap.
Story number 3.
There was an old, secluded boarding school nestled on the edge of a dark, thick forest. It had been standing for decades, its stone walls covered with ivy, its windows dark and empty. It was a place known for its strict discipline and cold, almost oppressive atmosphere. Students spoke in hushed tones about the school's strange history, but nobody ever spoke too loudly for fear of drawing the attention of the headmaster, Mr. Finch. He was an older man, well-dressed, with a sharp, calculating gaze that seemed to see straight through you. His presence was intimidating. Some even said he could hear every whisper in the hallways, though no one knew how. He had an air of authority that commanded silence and respect, but there was something about him that made students uncomfortable. They felt watched, even when he wasn't around. One rainy evening, as the school year was coming to a close, a new student arrived, Lily. She was a quiet girl, orphaned at a young age, and had been sent to the boarding school as a last resort. Her parents had chosen the school for its reputation of discipline and structure, but Lily was far from enthusiastic about her new home. Her room was cold, the walls too high, and the forest outside her window always seemed to shift in the corner of her vision. The first night she stayed, she lay in bed trying to sleep, but an odd sound kept her awake. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping against her window. She told herself it was just the rain, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was trying to get in. She nervously pulled the curtains back but saw nothing. Her heart pounded, and the feeling of being watched crept up her spine. The next day, she told a few of the other girls about the noise, but they all just laughed, dismissing it as the wind or the trees. But as the days passed, Lily began to feel the presence of something dark in the halls of the school. In the dead of night, she would hear footsteps outside her door, slow and deliberate, but when she opened it, no one would be there. One evening, as the school was in the midst of an eerie silence, Lily's curiosity got the better of her. She decided to explore the area around the school. She'd heard rumors about a forgotten part of the building, an old, abandoned section that had been sealed off years ago due to some unfortunate incident. The door to this part of the school was kept locked, but Lily found a way in, sneaking through a small crack in the basement where the stone walls had worn down over the years. What she found was a series of long, narrow corridors that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The air was damp, the walls covered in mildew, and the atmosphere oppressive. As she wandered deeper into the forgotten hallways, she found a set of wooden doors that were slightly ajar. They led to a room that felt like it had been untouched for years. But in the center of the room, there was a large mirror. The mirror was old and covered in grime, but it still reflected her image in a strange way, warped, like something wasn't quite right. Her reflection smiled at her, but she hadn't moved. A cold chill ran down her spine, and she stepped back, heart racing. Then, as if on cue, the reflection stopped smiling and began to tap on the glass, its fingers moving with unnerving precision. Lily spun around, her mind racing with questions. The corridor behind her was now darker than it should have been. Shadows seemed to shift, growing longer and deeper. But when she turned back to the mirror, her reflection was no longer there. Instead, there was a figure standing behind her, someone tall, their face hidden in shadow. Before she could react, the figure reached out and touched the glass, sending a shiver through her body. Lily bolted from the room, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. She raced back to her dorm room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. The next day, Lily tried to tell the others what she'd seen, but no one believed her. They told her the school was just old and full of creaks and groans. But Lily knew better. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, Something sinister had taken root in the school long ago. That night, Lily decided she couldn't stay in her room any longer. She couldn't explain it, but the walls felt like they were closing in on her. She needed to get out, to escape. As she stood in the hallway preparing to leave, she saw Mr. Finch walking toward her. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto hers, and for a moment she felt like he could see every dark thought she'd ever had. "Where do you think you're going, Lily?" His voice was smooth but edged with something cold. Lily stammered, unable to answer, her mind racing. Before she could react, he took a step closer. "You don't leave this school," he said quietly. "Not unless I allow it." Her body went rigid, and for a moment she was paralyzed with fear. But just as quickly, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to stay here. Not with him. Not with the school. With one final burst of courage, Lily turned and ran, bursting through the door to the woods beyond the school grounds. The trees loomed ominously, their branches twisting like skeletal hands in the moonlight. But no matter how fast she ran, she could still hear Mr. Finch's voice behind her, getting louder and louder. "You can't escape me," he whispered, though she couldn't see him. And then, all at once, the forest grew silent. The wind stopped, the trees stopped swaying, and Lily felt herself being pulled back like something invisible was dragging her toward the school. The next morning, the school was still, silent and empty. There were no signs of Lily. The only thing that remained was the old mirror in the forgotten hall, its surface now smooth and clean, reflecting only a faint, shadowy figure standing in front of it. And the whispers began again, in the halls, in the mirrors, in the shadows. You can never leave.
Story number 4.
It was a long, exhausting road trip. Mark and his girlfriend, Sarah, had been driving for hours, taking back roads to avoid the usual highway traffic. They were in the middle of nowhere, somewhere between two small towns, the kind of place where you didn't expect to see another car for miles. The sun was setting, casting a red hue over the horizon, and the air felt heavy, thick with the silence of the open road. They were just talking, laughing to keep themselves awake, when they saw the sign. It was an old, faded wooden board, barely visible under the thick layers of peeling paint. It read, "Welcome to Hollow Creek." Neither of them had ever heard of it, but the road seemed to lead into the small town, and they thought it would be a good place to stop for the night. As they entered, the town looked almost like a ghost town. The streets were eerily empty, with only a few dim lights in the distance. Old, weathered buildings lined the sides of the road, some with broken windows, others with their doors hanging off their hinges. The entire place felt abandoned, like it had been stuck in time for years. "Weird," Mark muttered, glancing around. "Let's just find somewhere to stay and get some rest." They turned onto a side street and found an old motel. The sign outside was rusty, with half of the lights flickering, but it looked like it was still open. They parked, unsure of what to expect, but when they entered the office, the smell of musty old wood hit them instantly. Behind the desk was a thin man, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through them. "Can I help you?" he asked in a voice that sounded strained, almost like he hadn't spoken in years. "We need a room for the night," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. The man nodded slowly and handed them a key. "Room 5. It's just down the hall. Don't go out at night," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, confused but too tired to press for more answers. They took the key and walked down the hall to their room. It was small, with old wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the bed looked like it hadn't been used in years. But they were too exhausted to care, so they unpacked quickly and collapsed into bed, hoping to get a good night's sleep before continuing their journey the next day. But as soon as they lay down, something felt off. The air was colder than it should have been, and there was a strange humming noise, like something deep in the walls was vibrating. Mark tried to ignore it, but Sarah kept glancing at the window, her eyes darting to the dark shape of the trees outside. "Mark, do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. At first, Mark couldn't hear anything, but then, as he lay still, he caught it. Faint, distant whispers. It sounded like a voice, but it was distorted, like a garbled static on an old radio. He sat up, his heart racing. "What the hell?" Suddenly, the door to their room slammed shut on its own, the hinges creaking under the pressure. Mark jumped out of bed, running to the door and trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. He looked back at Sarah, who was now standing by the window, her eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice barely audible. "I saw something outside. A person, but wrong. It didn't look human." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He rushed to the window and looked outside, but the trees were still, the night as silent as ever. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the humming sound stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, the air still thick with tension. But then something else, something worse, happened. From beneath the floorboards, they could hear it. A scratching, frantic noise, like something was trying to get out. Mark and Sarah exchanged a terrified glance. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, his hands shaking as he reached for the door again. This time, it opened with a creak, and they both stumbled into the hall. They ran toward the exit, desperate to leave the motel, but as they passed the other rooms, they noticed something strange. The doors were all slightly ajar, as if someone or something had been watching them the whole time. They burst out into the parking lot, only to freeze in place. Standing by their car was the man from the motel office. His face was blank, and his eyes were wide open, staring at them with an expression that was far from human. "Leave, now," he said, his voice low and rasping, like he was struggling to speak. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the trees around them began to sway violently, even though there was no wind. The sky above them grew darker, and the whispers returned, louder than before. From the corner of their eyes, they saw shadows moving in the distance, too many to count. Without a second thought, Mark grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the car. They jumped in and started the engine, tearing out of the parking lot at full speed. As they sped down the road, they could hear something chasing them, something that didn't belong in the real world. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away, but even then, they still felt the oppressive weight of the town on their backs. And when they finally looked back, Hollow Creek was gone, vanished as if it had never existed at all. But the strange humming and the whispers stayed with them long after. And to this day, if they ever find themselves driving on a lonely back road, they swear they can still hear the faintest whisper in the air. "Come back."
Story number 5.
It was the middle of winter, and Jared, an experienced hiker, decided to take a trip into the mountains for a solo adventure. He had been hiking in various parts of the country for years, and the idea of a solo trek through the remote northern wilderness had always called to him. He knew the risks, of course. He was well prepared with supplies and the proper gear, but there was something about the isolation that drew him in. He set off early in the morning, the cold air biting his skin as he trekked deeper into the forest. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the silence so absolute that it felt suffocating. The trees were dense, their skeletal branches casting long, eerie shadows on the snow. Despite the beauty of the landscape, there was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that felt unnatural. The further he went, the less he could hear anything. No birds, no wind, not even the distant sound of an animal moving. It was as if all life had vanished, leaving only the empty, frozen world behind. By late afternoon, Jared reached a small, abandoned cabin. The windows were boarded up, and the door was partially open, as if someone had left in a hurry. He figured it would be a good place to rest for the night, out of the cold. He approached cautiously, but when he stepped inside, the smell hit him immediately, mold and stale air. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with only a single old wooden chair and a table in the center of the room. There were no signs of recent use, but everything seemed off. It wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten, like it had been left to rot for decades. Jared decided to set up a small fire in the cabin's stone fireplace. As the flames flickered to life, he tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, but even that felt too loud in the heavy silence. Later that night, as Jared lay in the old bed, trying to sleep, he heard a faint scratching noise from the other side of the cabin. It started off as a soft, rhythmic scrape, like something was slowly dragging against the walls. He brushed it off, thinking it was the wind or perhaps a critter outside trying to get in. But then it grew louder, more deliberate, until it sounded like someone was scratching at the door. Jared's heart began to race. He had seen no one on his hike, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here, especially this far from civilization. The scratching grew more frantic, almost frantic enough to shake the door. "Who's out there?" Jared called, his voice trembling. No answer. The noise just continued. He grabbed his flashlight and crept cautiously to the door. His hand hovered over the handle, but he hesitated. Whatever was out there, it wasn't normal. The scratching had stopped, and now there was only silence. He waited, tense for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. Slowly he opened the door a crack, shining his flashlight into the night. There was nothing. Nothing except the snow-covered ground and the dark, towering trees. He sighed in relief and closed the door, convinced it had just been his imagination. But when he turned back around to face the cabin, his blood ran cold. There on the wooden floor were small, fresh footprints. Footprints leading from the corner of the cabin, where the walls met, toward the bed where he was standing. They were perfect in detail, as if someone had stepped right out of the shadows and into the room. Frozen in fear, Jared's mind raced. He hadn't heard anyone enter, and yet there were the footprints. They were damp too, cold and wet, like something had been walking in the snow. Slowly, he backed away from the door, but just as he was about to turn, he heard it again, the soft, faint scratching, only this time it was coming from inside the walls. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere behind the old wooden paneling, the walls themselves seemingly alive with whatever was inside. Jared's pulse quickened and panic set in. He rushed to the window, pulling aside the old curtains to get a look outside, but what he saw made his stomach drop. Standing just outside in the snow was a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, and cloaked in a black, tattered robe. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but its eyes, pale, hollow, and wide, were fixed directly on Jared. The figure raised one long, bony finger and pointed directly at him. In a blind panic, Jared slammed the curtains shut and bolted the door, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in. The scratching was louder now, unmistakably coming from all directions, from behind the walls, from the ceiling, from under the floorboards. Jared couldn't take it any longer. He grabbed his gear, threw open the door, and sprinted out into the freezing cold night. He didn't even look back as he ran, the snow now falling heavier than ever, the wind biting at his skin. But as he sprinted through the snow-covered forest, he could hear the sounds following him, the soft thud of footsteps just behind him, the scrape of something dragging on the ground. He ran for hours, driven by pure terror, not stopping until the morning light finally broke through the trees. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, he looked around, but there was nothing. No one. The forest was as silent as it had been when he first arrived. Jared didn't stop to question it. He made his way back to civilization and never spoke of the cabin, the figure, or the scratching ever again. But even now, years later, when he's alone in the woods, he can still hear it. The faintest sound of something scraping against the ground. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, he swears he can feel eyes watching him from the trees. Waiting. Just waiting.
Story number 6.
It was a rainy evening when Jake and his friends decided to take a shortcut through the woods. They had been driving for hours and were desperate to reach their destination, a remote cabin where they would spend the weekend. The GPS was no help. The rain was so heavy that it made visibility almost non-existent. They were lost, and with no other option, they decided to cut through the woods, hoping to find a road that would lead them back on track. They parked their car at the edge of the forest and set off on foot. The trees loomed like dark giants, their trunks slick with rain, the ground beneath them soft and muddy. The only sounds were the raindrops hitting the leaves and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. The air was thick with moisture, and a strange heaviness hung over the forest, like something was wrong. They walked for what felt like hours, though none of them said anything. The silence was oppressive, and every now and then, Jake would catch movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows that didn't quite match the trees around them, figures darting just out of view. He assumed it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but the more they walked, the more uneasy he felt. Eventually, they came to a clearing, and in the center, there stood an old house, its wooden frame half rotted, the windows dark and empty. The house wasn't on any of their maps, and it didn't look like it belonged anywhere in this part of the woods. It was a strange, decaying structure, one that shouldn't have been there at all. "Maybe we can take shelter here for the night," suggested Sarah, one of Jake's friends, her voice trembling with cold or fear. He couldn't tell. The others hesitated but agreed. They were tired, wet, and now starting to feel the weight of the isolation pressing on them. They made their way inside, the door creaking open with a painful groan, as if the house itself was protesting their intrusion. Inside, it was dark, the air stale and musty, thick with the scent of mold. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls seemed to close in around them, like the house was alive. They lit their phones to better see, and immediately the unsettling feeling that had been building in Jake's chest intensified. The walls were covered in old, yellowing photographs, people with pale faces, their eyes wide and glassy, staring directly at whoever dared to look at them. The images were old, most of them framed in tarnished gold, and they looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. "Who lived here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but I don't think we should be here," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of life. The house felt off, too quiet, too still. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. They decided to explore a bit further, hoping to find some clue as to who had lived here, or maybe just a safe place to sleep. The upstairs was even worse. The hallway stretched on endlessly, with rooms on either side that appeared to be untouched for years. In one of the rooms, they found a small wooden chest sitting in the corner. Sarah, ever the curious one, opened it. Inside was a collection of strange objects, rusted keys, an old pocket watch, and what looked like dried flowers wrapped in a yellowed cloth. But it was the small, weathered book at the bottom that caught Jake's attention. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. The words were scrawled in a language he didn't recognize, and there were sketches. Terrifying sketches of people with twisted, distorted faces. Just as Jake was about to put the book down, he heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the stairs. His heart raced, and he motioned for everyone to be quiet. They all listened, straining to hear. The steps continued, echoing through the silence of the house, as though something, was slowly climbing the stairs toward them. Without thinking, Jake shoved the book into his bag and turned to the others. "We need to get out of here now." But before they could move, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening crash. The house seemed to groan, like it was alive, and the air grew cold. Sarah screamed, and the others rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. From behind them, they heard something shift, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of dragging footsteps. The walls seemed to close in on them, the photographs on the walls shifting ever so slightly, as if the faces in them were turning to watch. Jake's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to open the door, but it wouldn't move. Then, through the crack beneath the door, he saw it. A figure, tall and hunched, its face obscured by darkness. It was dragging something heavy behind it, scraping across the floor. The sound was agonizing, like nails on a chalkboard. The figure's footsteps grew louder, closer. It stopped right outside the door, and Jake's heart skipped a beat when he realized it was breathing, heavy, ragged, as though it was exhausted from chasing them. "Stay calm," he whispered to the others. "On 3, we push the door open and run." But before he could even count, the door shook violently, the wood splintering. The thing on the other side was trying to get in, its breath ragged and quick. 1, 2. Jake never got to say 3. The door burst open with a deafening crash. The thing was on them in an instant, its long, skeletal hand reaching through the doorway, its claws scraping the air. Jake screamed as he grabbed Sarah and pulled her toward the window. They didn't care about anything else. They just had to get out. They jumped through the window, the glass shattering around them, and landed hard on the wet ground outside. They scrambled to their feet, but when they turned around to look at the house, it was gone. The place where it had stood was now just an empty clearing in the woods. The rain had stopped, the trees were still, and they were alone. But when they checked their phones, every one of them had a strange message, just a single, chilling line of text. "You are not alone." They didn't stay to see what that meant. They ran, and they never spoke of it again. But sometimes when Jake is alone at night, he can still hear the dragging footsteps, and he knows without a doubt that something is still out there following them, something that knows their name.
Story number 7.
The storm was ferocious that night, tearing through the small town with an intensity that rattled the windows. Lisa and her brother, Matt, had been visiting their grandmother's old house for the weekend. The house sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods and with a reputation for being a little odd. Their grandmother had always been a bit of an enigma to them, quiet, reserved, and often seen staring out of the windows as if waiting for something. That night, as the wind howled and the rain hammered against the house, Lisa and Matt found themselves huddled around the fireplace, trying to stay warm. Their grandmother, as usual, had disappeared upstairs to her room, leaving them to their own devices. But it wasn't long before the strange noises began. At first, it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But soon they started hearing something else, soft footsteps moving across the floor above them, slow and deliberate. They exchanged a nervous glance. "Maybe it's Grandma," Matt suggested, though his voice lacked confidence. "She's not coming down," Lisa replied, her tone uncertain. They listened in silence, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, then a door creaked open, followed by a series of faint muttered words, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably human. It sounded like someone was talking, but they were alone in the house. Or at least, they thought they were. "Maybe we should check on her," Lisa said, standing up. Matt reluctantly followed, his unease growing with every step they took toward the staircase. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fireplace in the next room. As they ascended the stairs, they noticed the door to their grandmother's room was ajar. They approached cautiously, Lisa's hand trembling as she reached out to push the door open. Inside, the room was dark, save for the soft glow of a single candle flickering on the bedside table. Their grandmother was sitting in her armchair by the window, staring out into the storm. She didn't even turn when they entered. "Grandma?" Lisa called, but her voice trembled with uncertainty. Their grandmother didn't respond. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the window, as if she was waiting for something or someone. "Grandma, are you okay?" Matt asked, his voice more insistent now. Finally, she turned slowly, her eyes wide and glassy, as if seeing something only she could see. There was a strange smile on her lips, one that didn't quite match the fear in her eyes. "I've been waiting for him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's here." Before they could respond, the room grew cold, unnaturally cold, and the door slammed shut behind them. The air grew thick, and the candle flickered wildly, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The temperature dropped even more, and Lisa shivered as she felt something move behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing except the shadows creeping along the walls, getting closer. Suddenly, their grandmother stood up, her movements jerky, unnatural. She pointed toward the window, her voice low and trembling. "He's coming." Lisa's heart raced as she stepped back, her gaze locked on her grandmother. Her once familiar face was now twisted in fear, her eyes pleading with them to understand something she couldn't explain. Then, through the rain-soaked window, they saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing just at the edge of the woods. It was still, its body thin like a skeleton, its face hidden in the dark. Its eyes, they glowed faintly, two pale, flickering orbs in the blackness. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she realized that it was staring directly at her. "Leave now," their grandmother shouted, but her voice was no longer hers. It was warped, distorted, as if something else had taken control of her body. "You have to leave. He will take you too." Before they could even react, the room seemed to distort around them. The walls stretched, the air grew heavy, and the shadows began to move, curling like tendrils around the room as if reaching for them. The figure outside moved closer, its movements impossibly slow yet purposeful, each step like a whisper in the wind. In a panic, Lisa grabbed Matt's hand, pulling him toward the door. But it wouldn't open. The door was locked, the handle shaking violently as if something on the other side was trying to get in. The air grew even colder, and they could hear something tapping against the window, a light, rhythmic sound, like fingernails dragging across glass. Desperate, Lisa turned back to their grandmother, but she was no longer in the room. The chair by the window was empty, and the figure outside had vanished. All that remained was the heavy silence, broken only by the incessant tapping, and then the whisper. It was faint at first, barely a breath in the still air, but soon it grew louder, clearer, until it seemed to fill the room. The whispering voices weren't speaking to each other. They were speaking to Lisa and Matt, their names repeated over and over again, each time louder, more insistent. "Come with us." The door suddenly burst open, and the room was filled with a deafening roar of wind and rain. It felt like the very house was alive, shaking and twisting with the force of something terrible pushing from within. Lisa and Matt didn't hesitate. They ran down the hallway, not looking back, not stopping until they reached the front door. They tore it open, stepping out into the storm. But when they looked back, the house was gone. There was no sign of their grandmother, no sign of the house they had just left behind. The land where it had stood was completely empty. The only thing left was the howling wind and the dark, cold trees. In the distance, far in the woods, they could still hear it. The whisper. And though they never spoke of it again, they knew they would never be the same. The house was gone, but something had followed them from there. A presence, an emptiness, something that would always be with them, lurking just at the edges of their vision, waiting.
Story number 8.
On a warm autumn night, a group of friends, Claire, James, Peter, and Rachel, decided to take a trip out of the city for a weekend getaway. They had heard about an old, abandoned motel deep in the woods, one that was said to be haunted. It wasn't on any maps, but the locals would occasionally mention it in hushed tones, warning of strange occurrences surrounding the place. Despite the warnings, their curiosity got the best of them, and they figured it would be the perfect spot for an adventure. The drive was long, winding through dense forests where the trees grew thick, and the air was heavy with the smell of decay. As they neared the area, the road grew rough, and the forest seemed to close in on them. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would want to be after dark. When they finally reached the motel, it was exactly as they had imagined. The building was run down, with broken windows and an eerie silence that made Claire feel uneasy. The neon sign outside was barely flickering, its dull red glow casting an unsettling light over the scene. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. "Are you sure we should stay here?" Claire asked, her voice laced with doubt. James, the most adventurous of the group, shrugged. "It's just an old motel. There's nothing to be afraid of." With a nervous laugh, Rachel agreed. "Yeah, it's just a bit creepy, but we're here to have fun. Let's check it out." The group decided to make the best of it. They grabbed their bags and entered the lobby. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. The walls were covered with peeling wallpaper, and the wooden floors creaked with every step they took. The reception desk was empty, but there was a dusty old ledger on the counter. A single bell sat next to it. James rang the bell, and to their surprise, a thin man emerged from the back. His face was pale, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome," he said in a gravelly voice. "I wasn't expecting guests, but I suppose it's been a while since anyone came through these parts." The man handed them a set of keys to a room on the second floor, and they thanked him before heading up the stairs. The air on the second floor felt colder, and the silence seemed to press against them. The hallway stretched out longer than they expected, with doors lining both sides. Their room, 217, was at the far end. As they opened the door to their room, the smell of old carpet and stale air hit them. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the bed, though made, had an unsettling creak when Claire sat on it. It felt wrong, like the room was untouched for a reason. "I'm going to check out the place," James said. "Anyone want to come?" Rachel and Peter declined, opting to stay behind and unpack. But Claire felt a sudden urge to follow James. There was something about the place that made her feel uneasy, and she wasn't sure why. Maybe she just wanted to get out of the room for a while, but something told her there was more to the motel than just its appearance. The two of them made their way downstairs and began exploring the property. They passed empty rooms, their doors hanging open, revealing little more than dust and cobwebs. The air was so still, it felt suffocating. When they reached the back of the motel, Claire noticed a small door leading into what looked like a basement. It was slightly ajar, and the air that escaped from it felt unnaturally cold. Claire stopped in her tracks, feeling a tight knot form in her stomach. "Do you think we should go down there?" she whispered to James, who seemed to be drawn to the door, despite his usual bravado. "Of course," James said, grinning. "What's the worst that could happen?" The two of them stepped down the creaky wooden stairs, the darkness swallowing them up with every step. The air grew colder, and Claire could hear the sound of something. Breathing, or maybe humming? She wasn't sure, but it felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of place where anyone would leave alive, if that made sense. As they reached the bottom, Claire's flashlight flickered and then died, leaving them in total darkness. James cursed under his breath, trying to get it to work. Then, just ahead of them, the flashlight beam caught something, a strange glowing shape on the wall. It was a symbol, drawn in what looked like old dried blood. It was an intricate circular pattern, with strange markings that neither of them recognized. The air was thick, and for a moment the humming sound became louder, almost deafening. Suddenly, Claire's flashlight flickered back to life. She swung it around and froze. There, standing in the corner of the basement, was a figure. A tall, gaunt woman, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. She was dressed in an old, tattered nightgown, her long black hair falling in front of her face. But her eyes were what froze Claire in place. They were wide, unblinking, and empty, hollow, dark. The woman began to move toward them, her feet dragging slowly across the floor, the sound of her shuffling footsteps echoing through the basement. Claire couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the woman's form grew closer and closer until she was only a few feet away. Claire could see the faint outline of a smile, almost a smirk, on the woman's face, though her expression was otherwise blank. "Get out," the woman whispered, her voice a soft rasp. It wasn't a warning. It was an order. Claire didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed James's arm, pulling him toward the stairs. They ran up the steps, back into the dim light of the motel, but when they turned to look at the basement door, it was sealed shut, completely locked. "Let's go," Claire said, panic rising in her chest. Now. They ran out of the motel, back to their car, the sound of footsteps following them, growing fainter and fainter until they couldn't hear anything at all. The drive home was long and silent. None of them spoke. They never mentioned the woman, the basement, or the strange glowing symbol. They didn't need to. When they passed the woods again, the place where the motel had stood was empty, completely gone, as if it had never existed. No trace of the building remained. But Claire could still hear the woman's whisper in her head, echoing over and over, "Get out."
Story number 9.
It was a typical weekend getaway for Adam and his girlfriend Sarah when they decided to visit an isolated cabin deep in the mountains. They had been hearing about it from friends who swore it was the perfect retreat, quiet, private, and surrounded by untouched nature. But what they didn't know was that the cabin had a history, one that wasn't so easily forgotten. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding, the road narrowing as they ascended the mountainside. The landscape around them was breathtaking, but an eerie stillness hung in the air, like the world had gone silent. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk was setting in, casting long shadows across the thick forest surrounding them. The cabin itself was small, tucked away between towering pine trees, and appeared to be well maintained. The wooden beams and stone fireplace gave it a rustic charm. They were excited to start their weekend in the wilderness, so after unpacking, they decided to light a fire and relax. As the evening wore on, the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. They were enjoying their evening, talking and laughing, when Adam noticed something odd. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound of animals outside, no wind rustling through the trees. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "You feel that?" Adam asked, his voice low. Sarah looked at him quizzically. "Feel what?" Like something's watching us," he said, scanning the windows. Sarah laughed, brushing it off. "You're just spooked. It's a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. What do you expect?" But Adam couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It wasn't just the stillness of the night, it was something more, something watching. The unease only grew as the night wore on. Sarah went to bed, but Adam stayed up, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin grew cold. He checked the locks on the windows and door again, despite already doing so earlier. The darkness outside felt like it was closing in, suffocating. Around 3 a.m., Adam heard it, footsteps. Slow and deliberate, moving around the outside of the cabin. He froze, his heart pounding. The steps were heavy, like someone was dragging their feet. They circled the cabin before stopping, and then there was silence. Adam's first instinct was to wake Sarah, but something stopped him. He felt like if he moved, if he made a sound, whatever was out there would know. Instead, he stayed still, listening, his breath shallow. The footsteps started again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if the person or thing was circling the cabin more than once. After what felt like an eternity, the steps finally stopped. Adam waited, straining to hear anything. The silence was deafening. Then a whisper, so faint, so soft, came from outside. "Let me in." Adam's blood ran cold. The voice was distorted, like it was coming through the walls themselves, and yet it was so close, too close. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. His mind was screaming at him to do something, but all he could do was listen to the whisper, which continued. "Let me in. It's so cold. Let me in." And then a soft tapping at the window. Adam's eyes shot to the window, heart hammering in his chest. The moonlight barely lit up the edges of the forest, but there, standing just outside the window, was a figure. A man, thin and hunched, his face obscured by a hood. The tapping continued, slow, rhythmic, as if the figure was trying to get his attention. "Let me in, please." Adam couldn't move. He was frozen, staring at the figure, unable to tear his gaze away. The tapping stopped, and the figure slowly turned, moving out of view. But that wasn't what terrified Adam the most. What terrified him was the realization that the figure hadn't left. He could still hear the shuffling of feet, faint but unmistakable, around the side of the cabin. He finally snapped out of his trance, rushing to Sarah's side. She was still asleep, unaware of the terror outside their door. But Adam couldn't just lie there. He couldn't stay in that cabin another second. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed for help. But before he could speak, the line went dead. There was no signal. The connection dropped and the cabin was once again engulfed in silence. The tapping returned. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was at the door. Slow, rhythmic, as if someone was carefully trying to get inside. "Let me in. I'm so cold." Adam backed away from the door, panic rising in his chest. He didn't know what was out there, but whatever it was, it wanted in. He grabbed his jacket and yanked Sarah out of bed. "Wake up, Sarah. We need to go. Now!" She woke groggily, confused. "What's going on?" "There's someone outside. We need to leave. Now!" Without waiting for a response, Adam pulled Sarah toward the door. As he reached for the handle, the tapping stopped. A low, guttural growl came from the other side. Something not human. Something far worse. Adam yanked the door open, dragging Sarah into the night. The cold air hit them like a wall. He looked around, desperately searching for the car, but the forest was dark, and the trees seemed to have grown even closer, blocking their path. The only sound was the distant echo of that growl, coming from the woods, growing louder with each passing second. "Run!" Adam screamed. They ran through the dense trees, not daring to look back, only pushing forward. After what felt like hours of running, they finally stumbled upon the road. Adam's heart was still racing as they reached their car, jumping in without hesitation. He slammed the keys into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. As they sped down the mountain road, the trees seemed to recede behind them, the dark forest finally giving way to the faint glow of distant city lights. But when Adam glanced in the rearview mirror, he froze. There, at the edge of the forest, stood the figure, motionless, just watching. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away, and even then, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following them, something that had been waiting for them at the cabin and would never let them go. They never spoke of the trip again, but sometimes in the dead of night, Adam could still hear the tapping, still feel the eyes watching, and he knew, with an unsettling certainty, that whatever had been out there in the woods was still waiting, still following.